Hello, hello. Thank you back to my channel and watching my build series on building out my Expedition Camper. Thank you for joining and watching my videos. As you probably saw in my last video, we actually built out the camper. The one before that, test fitting all the pieces so that we could get to this stage, and the one before that, actually building out the floor and attaching it. And of course, the 18 videos or so before that, actually prepping the chassis to get to this point. And after building the camper, boy, I have to say, it was really hard to actually leave it that night. It looked so pretty sitting out there. I did not want to leave it, but I had to get back to building the camper the next day. And in this video, I actually showcase some of my great balance skills on top of a ladder, something you probably shouldn't do. So hang on and let's watch what's going to happen in this video. It's going to be fun. After it's so hard to leave the night before, especially with some nice bright moonlight lighting up my brand new camper box, nearly complete. It was so hard to leave Hunter RMV and leave my camper there, but the sealant had to dry some, and so we got started the next morning, and I was so excited to get started on building out the upper portion of the rear wall and rear floor, which really blocks in the upper bed platform that I have here, and that's why I have this squared off departure angle, which I'll go into more in a future video very soon and go over the design of my camper. Nonetheless, the Hunter RMV team and I were quick at it as always with a plan to figure out what we need to do that day, make sure we had everything all set up, all of our tools and parts and components all out. We started getting everything laid out and all the different extrusions and wall panels all sealed up and cleaned well with rubbing alcohol to make sure that any of the surfaces that where the adhesive would go would be there. Here we're actually removing the steel bars that are embedded within the FRP extrusions within the rear wall, the two center ones, and I made the decision to remove those two center ones, which is pretty easy to pull those out. We just had to hammer them out. And I did that because they add a lot of extra weight, and we already have to lift this panel up, and it was going to be heavy and hard to lift that panel up. We went ahead and removed those two because they would actually be right in about the way of where my rear window on this rear wall was going to be, and so it wouldn't make any sense to have to cut those while this is in place in order to get that rear window in. And also, they probably wouldn't really be supporting much weight, if any weight, up there, because what am I really going to put as far as storage that high off the ground? So I decided to remove the two center steel supports, but leave the two on the sides because I have an idea for a storage box that will go up there that'll be electrically lowering down to the ground for some storage items there, and I'll go over that in the future. But we nonetheless removed those two steel bars. That probably took out about a 20 or 30 pounds out of that wall. It's pretty significant. Since those structural supports won't be needed in there for attaching things to the rear wall. We blew out the FRP extrusions with some compressed air, and then I came up with the idea of using some small PVC tubing to act as an extension from some expanding foam can sealant wand to reach all the way down into the very end of those extrusions there, or at least into the middle, and be able to get from each side to be able to spray expanding foam all the way through and fill those up. So that way there is not only expanding foam in there to provide additional sealant to keep anything, any air movement or pressure changes, but of course to provide that insulation there. As always, Curtis with Hunter RMV came forth with a good plan in the morning, as he did every day of this week. It was always fantastic on the build to have him really think through everything. And so we reviewed our plan, we modified it from what we had done the days before, and we started getting busy with, again, laying out over tools and parts and so forth. Once that expanding foam and those two center channels dried, we cut off the edges, cleaned up all the edges really well, and of course the panel itself really well with rubbing alcohol, and then got busy actually test fitting all of the extrusions. This may sound unnecessary or fairly easy, but it really gets complicated with all these different pieces coming together in these corners here, and some are coming together as squared corners, some are coming together with mitered corners. and make sure everything was cut perfectly and all lined well perfectly together, and then marking all the extrusions to make sure we had everything perfectly laid out, lined out, so we knew what everything would go to. This was somewhat important too, because even though Total Composites labels every one of the extrusions, some of those labels came off while they were stored after shipping in the storage until the EarthCruiser core chassis was complete, because that was delayed for about 2 months or so. That some of that stuff was stored in shipping for a while, so had to go ahead and get stuff basically relabeled, make sure we test fit everything and marked it ourselves so we knew exactly where everything went and so forth. The plan for today was actually to install this upper rear wall and the upper rear floor. We had to plan out that the upper rear floor had to go on first, and that made sense. And so we had to plan out how to do this, and also what would happen with all these lower extrusions and how they'd all go together, so that we could really plan out and know that I could install later, after this upper rear wall and rear floor were on, install the lower rear floor and lower rear wall. And that was really important because there was going to be a process to do that, since we were doing it essentially in the opposite, in which the way that this camper box was built or intended to be built. It was intended to be built where you really start from the bottom of the rear wall, from the floor, and work your way up. And that rear wall would be, the upper wall would be the last cap or last wall that would go on to cap everything off. In this case, I was doing it the opposite way. And this was intentional because I really needed to be able to maintain access into the camper box, and because there was no entry door or any other openings cut. So I had to be able to get in there until I cut the entry door opening. And it just seemed to make more sense to be able to get in there from the floor level instead of have to climb over that on a really tall ladder, to be able to get in there with tools and everything else to work inside of there. So that was the approach I took. And so we had to work a little bit plan to make sure that that would work. And we came together with our mutual heads and agreed that, yeah, this is all going to work, and came up with a plan to do that. And that will be in a future video as to how that all comes together. It is pretty complex, but nonetheless, this is how we approached it. So a lot of prep and so forth here. Getting the actual lower or upper rear floor on there wasn't too hard. It's pretty lightweight. It doesn't have any structural steel supports in it. And so it's not only fairly light, it's a fairly small panel. So after cleaning everything up and getting everything all prepped and so forth, we could get that glued and put up in there. After we made several small little cuts in the corners of the extrusions to make sure they all fit together ever so perfectly. And I mean perfectly, meaning that really there'd be nothing but as much as an 1/8 inch gap between the extrusions, so that they would all fit and compress right up together with the sealant put in between them. And you may be asking, like, why build the upper rear wall now? Why not just wait until I basically built the whole interior of the camper? And my decision there was a couple of things. One is I really felt more comfortable driving it home with that upper rear wall and floor in place, just to give the camper box a lot more structural rigidity. Definitely create a lot of torsional strength of those camper walls so they wouldn't flex in the rear, even though they were essentially held together by the ceiling and the floor. Just having that rear wall, at least in the upper rear wall and floor, would really give it a lot more strength. And so I just felt a lot more comfortable driving it home that way. And the second reason why, there was no reason to wait. I didn't need that upper rear wall out to install cabinets and bring things in like that. That lower rear wall being out was plenty tall enough to still be able to lift refrigerators and bigger things up in there and install them that way, if I chose not to install them through the entry door, which was also the other option and really what my plan was. The other reason for installing this upper rear wall and upper rear floor, doing this now, is because I had a lot of help. I had many hands, and many hands makes easier work. And I knew that this upper rear wall was quite heavy. When we lifted it out and set it on the table and to clean it up, we realized that it was a pretty heavy panel because of these supports that were in there. And it's also a thicker, heavier wall. It does have plywood in it as well. The floor and the rear walls have plywood because they are structural and also intend to have things mounted to them. And so with many hands and expert, or hands with experience installing these and all the different equipment and many ladders and so forth, this was the right time to go ahead and install that. So we got busy working on that now, even though it was certainly a lot of work to do it. We had beautiful winter weather to get up there and do this, and it was great to be able to work with the Hunter R&V team once again to get this upper rear wall in place. There was certainly, before we did that, I also climbed up on the ceiling, checked the caulk and sealant lines that we had done from the day before, cleaned up a little bit of mess here and there, and just checked also the water sealant on the roof and stood on a ladder at the top of the ladder. And I definitely suggest you don't do that, but sometimes that's kind of what you have to do to get up to these upper heights. And fortunately, I did not fall, but I was able to keep my balance. But certainly, again, you should not do this. When looking up on the ceiling here, you can see there's still some condensation from the night before that was built up on the ceiling, and later on that all dried off, which was fortunate because I did have to go climb up there in order to basically help pull this upper rear wall onto the ceiling, which was a challenge. And I'm also quite proud of how close I got the front wall of the camper box to the cab. It's as close as it could get. It literally just barely not misses touching an engine insulation cover over the back of the engine, which was all by design, by measuring everything out on the cab, looking at the bodybuilder's guide, taking a look at the detailed measurements, and doing some math to calculate the camper box, how close I could get it based on the subframe and how close I get to the engine mount, and also everything else, the rounded corner on the front of the camper box. So fortunate that all worked out really, really well. And I'll go over more on this in the future when I talk about my ceiling between the camper box and the cab and the pass-through that I'm building for that, and how I'm going to seal those up, and why I really wanted those as close as they could be. And in part also is a 133-inch wheelbase chassis, a phenomenally short chassis wheelbase, so very maneuverable. And I wanted this total length down at essentially the ground level to be able to park into a normal parking space, and total length to accommodate a 16-foot camper box, which this is in 16 feet in total length, to still be at around 21 feet, which it is. And so in order to maximize and optimize for that 16-foot camper box and fit it all within a 21-foot total length was really quite an achievement, and I'm really glad to say it all worked out. One of the tricks that I pulled out and had planned about and thought about was really bringing out some big woodworking clamps that I had from my woodworking days to clamp up that low rear floor. Unfortunately, I didn't catch any video of us installing it, but it actually went really quick and pretty easy. Here we're actually test fitting the upper rear wall, and I said test fitting, no adhesives. Just go ahead and test fitting it, figure out how it's going to go on, make sure we have really our process set up of who's going to be where, what they're going to be doing, what tools we need, how we need ladders set up, talking about getting it figured out so we know we're going to install this. This, again, upper wall is very heavy, and it takes a lot of hands to lift it up this high to even the top of these 6-foot ladders to get it all the way up off the ground, high enough to get it up over the ceiling and up on there, make sure that everything fits. Again, test fitting all of the extrusions one by one and test fitting them as an assembly in a small wall like this is really crucial, because once you have that adhesive sealant on there is no turning back. You have to move quickly to get everything installed. And you'll see here in the video in a little bit, that is really a lifesaver for us. And so now that these clamps are on, make sure they're tight and they're clamped up well, and that adhesive sealant is gluing and holding that lower rear floor or upper rear floor that's clamped on there, and that we're not causing any scratching on the camper body, and are also not in the way. And then getting other clamps ready and prepared that we're going to use a little bit later. This really helped us make sure that everything was lined up, queued up, and ready for this, what was going to be really a very tough lift and insulation of this upper rear wall. So with these clamps in place and kept in place to hold this lower rear wall on, we got busy gluing up all of the extrusions, mounting them to this rear wall. So they were all glued up, and getting all the other edges of the extrusions that we're going to attach onto the existing sidewalls, the ceiling, and that upper rear floor now, getting all those glued up. And it was a lot of work to get all those glued up. There's a lot of those. It probably took us about 15 or 20 minutes just to get all the adhesive sealant onto all those edges. And then we quickly moved to get everything queued up, set up, ourselves set up, make sure we had our latex gloves on, because we knew we were going to get dirty with some sealant on us, since there was sealant essentially on all sides of this panel. And now we got to lift up this panel with sealant all the way around it, and lift it up into place and hold it in place and push it into place with this sealant all around. So now that we have our masking tape in place, it's already there to keep that sealant from pushing out beyond where we want it. We basically got busy and started to get everything lined up with extra latex gloves in all of our pockets, extra paper towels handy, somebody ready to run around and grab extra latex gloves or paper towels, or also rubbing alcohol to wipe it off the sealant if it did splooge out in a place where we didn't need it, and then start lifting up this big heavy panel and putting it into place. So we flipped over the panel, got the sealant down the other edges, and lifted this up the ladders into place. And let me tell you, lifting this panel up into place, because it's heavy, it's fairly large, and we had a lot of us working together, and again, there's sealant around all the edges. It was a challenge, and also it was pretty precarious to have us all up on this ladder, or many of us up on these ladders, holding this panel up and pushing it into place, and particularly because we had to get extrusions all lined up on both sides, the ceiling and the upper floor. And it turned out that while doing this, we really struggled to get the upper extrusion pressed onto the ceiling. It was not easy at all. It looks like easy work in the video here in this time-lapse video, but it was not. We were struggling, we were getting exhausted, so much so that because we couldn't get that upper extrusion over the lip of the ceiling, we were actually all getting fatigued in our arms, our hands, our shoulders. Were struggling to keep this thing up, and it wasn't really going to be many more minutes that we could hold this in place before we were going to have to make a decision about what to do, and that meant probably taking it down and taking a break and reapproaching. The problem is this adhesive sealant skins up in about 15 to 30 minutes. And being that we had fairly cool weather and dry weather, it was probably a little bit longer than that, but not much. And so you can see here, I climb up onto the ceiling of the new camper, which is pretty high off the ground. It's a little precarious being up there, but had to go up there with a putty knife and a rubber mallet to essentially help make things squeeze into place or work them into place. And other guys were doing the same on other sections. In hindsight, we learned that it probably would have been much better if we actually clipped the upper extrusion over the ceiling first and then worked it on the lower. That would have helped hold things in place. We could have worked on that when we had more strength and not weren't so exhausted by getting that upper section up onto it. And then it would have been easier to work that lower section down in and let the extrusion just kind of slide down ever so slightly to get into place. We also learned a couple more tricks when doing these upper rear panels when we're doing those, and I'll go over those in my future video of installing those lower rear panels, which is coming up soon. But in the meantime, yeah, we really struggled. We were tired. And when you can see here, we're also fighting daylight. Being it's wintertime, the light is fading quickly. It cools off quickly. And so we really got to go and get everything cleaned up. All these sealant edges and the extrusions sealed up around their edges, things cleaned up from the sealant, and make sure that we don't leave any tape and so forth on that was to catch that push out residue. We also went ahead and left those blue tape stripes that go vertically up the rear wall on to make sure they mark where the structural supports on the rear wall. Again, those tapes do not go into where the extrusions are because obviously we don't want to conflict with where the sealant is in those extrusions, but they are there to mark, so I know where to go and attach into those in the future. There's also another trick on how to find those other than just looking up the dimensions and measuring out, and that is to use a magnet and just find them that way. But once we were all done, I was so happy with the Hunter R&V team and their help in having this done in its more completed state. I have to say it looked a lot better in its more completed state. I was thrilled to have it, so it's nearly done, and so that it's structurally strong, and so that I could actually come back a couple days later and actually pick it up, knowing that now the adhesive sealant was pretty well dry, in place, and everything was strong after several days of everything being able to glue up. And now it's starting to look like a real expedition camper, so it's getting pretty exciting. And I am thrilled and excited to get this thing home, but in a future video, I'm going to talk a little about some of the challenges I had pulled at home. Due to a incorrect measurement from EarthCruiser on the height of the frame, I was not going to get this in my garage without letting some air of the tires, which I had to do, and later even modify my garage, which I'll go into more in a future video as well. Hang tight, keep watching, and please do subscribe and share with others.